back again. Dan?
Hello there.
It's the third episode in this podcast. I'm predicting this might be sort of the driest, and people might think that the others have been pretty dry already.
Surely not.
Surely, hopefully not.
I feel that background sound for realism.
Maybe they like that
we planned.
But the idea of this one, hopefully, is what I thought might be helpful is a sort of a reference point for people that maybe when they're going into a meeting where they're going to try and break down a more strategic plan, they could maybe go back to this episode and they could just kind of hear these steps. So again, to make it more teachable, 2 reasons: to provide a framework. 1, if you're not naturally kind of strategic, it gives you that kind of scaffold to sort of to drive your ideas through. And 2, if you are sort of naturally strategic, you could break it down and sort of say, right, which areas of this framework am I really strong with? And is there one that's an 8 out of 10? And if I drive that up as well, I could make myself even stronger in this area. So that's the sort of purpose. So the framework itself, I'm just going to double check the number of steps. 9, which is this will be interesting to hear me kind of walk through this. So don't fall asleep and snore. I won't. We don't need any more sort of ambient noise. But the framework itself starts with breaking down. You have to start with why, and this could actually, as you move through, this could actually be step 2, because if you don't have a why, if you don't have a really clear vision, you need to create that. But once you have, the second step is just defining what you want to achieve. So we're talking about, right, so we're predicting that there could be an issue sort of beyond this horizon. What is it that we want to achieve? What is it we want to avoid? Or equally, when you're in a good strategic place, you'll focus more on what do we want to take advantage of.
Yep.
Now that might be your start point, and then your second point is, right, so how does this help our vision? Yes. How does that help that why? So those 2 steps could be interchangeable.
Yep, I get that.
If that makes sense. The third is to assess really clearly, like, how close are you to that?
Yeah.
So that gap between, and you'll hear those that have sort of done other parts of this, the Kilter program, there's a lot of the soda loop here.
Yes.
Because strategic is soda loops are designed to help you make decisions under pressure that are balanced, whereas when you're making more strategic decisions, you have more time, so there are more elements to it. So it's really important that you take emotion out of it and say, how far off are we? Because sometimes you can say, oh, that's an enormous task, but you actually think, oh, we're a lot closer than we were last year. So actually, this isn't. But so it's about being realistic and having perspective on how close you are. The next step is to look at the possibilities and advantages. So then you start to look at those options, exactly like the soda loop. So to bridge us between here and there, and then look at so. Seeing as we're trying to do something bigger, seeing as we're trying to achieve this vision, how does this situation, really add fuel to that? And that's where you can get to a really good place strategically when that you make those links more often. Then moving on, and this is quite an important difference between strategic planning and simply action planning, is to really predict those patterns of risk. There's patterns of considerations. When you do an action plan, more typically starts with a target, what you want to achieve, the things you're going to do to achieve it, and the milestones that you might try to sort of use to monitor, and then that kind of you get to the success criteria. A strategic plan starts to it's much more based in real life.
I was going to say it's much more realistic, isn't it? Because it considers, okay, well, what's going to go wrong?
Yeah, and it's and not pessimistic, realistic. It's
you're more empowered to deal with those things, whereas you're right, rather than an action plan. I think that's an important consideration, definitely. And like this whole process here, it does require a balanced skill set, because the next stage is to look at the sort of resources that you've got. Being really realistic about how much time can we actually give to this. How many people have we got? That kind of things. And then, there is a step here which maybe, is about sort of filtering through your values. I think maybe if we can come back to that sort of part, because that is a level that might be distracting, if this was the first time you were sort of doing this. Yeah. But I do think an important stage is establishing the metrics. For some people,
there's kind of people leading with more yellow. That might be really boring to start to sort of talk about. And actually, it could be something really constraining for those people who are more logistically minded. But one of the key things with establishing the metrics that you're going to measure is that's a really important phase of working strategically for me, because a team can become quite disheartened when they're putting a lot of hours and work into something that they're not going to see the fruits of their labour in 18 months. And if they can see a number going up, they can focus on that. Definitely. And it can be a really important step. And also it can help you adjust, because if that number isn't moving, you don't want to just keep doing and then in 18 months say, well, there you go. So although that can kind of, we might talk about, something like, succession planning and CPD and helping to. So metrics there can sound quite cold.
Yeah, they're harder, but it does. But I also think an important part of that step is it should link back to the gaps as well, doesn't it? So once you've defined what you want success to look like, and you've thought, right, how close are we, or how far away are we, which will then determine things like typical time frames and what we're looking at. So not only to inform and determine what sort of actions are required and what professional development is required, who do we need to contribute to this, etc. That step of establishing those are going to give the different people involved the type of metrics and milestones they will need for their part in it to know if it's working or not, which is really important, because as you say, if it's not working, we need to get back together and reflect on it, or it's it's a motivational element as well. So I think it is important.
And I think maybe that's the best place to kind of hover around, because I think that sort of picking, like, spotting the problem, I think most leaders, that's quite a natural thing. You're living. It is breathing.
Problem solving is a fundamental part of the role of school leadership, isn't it?
And then maybe if I just speak to my experience of people that have sort of been on that journey of moving from an area where they don't consider themselves naturally strategic to being more confident strategically.
Yeah.
A big step in that framework that we've just gone through is being realistic about the constraints.
Yeah.
Being realistic about the problems that they're going to face, rather than sort of saying, right, okay, I've got this plan, and if everything goes well, this is going to be great. That the transition happens when they go, well, it's not going to. Like, there is no. What we've faced in the last 4 years. 5 years, nobody would have predicted that. Well, they'd have some serious problems, I'd say. If they'd
that's amazing.
But that being said, no plan will work. No plan will work if it will only work if there are no issues. So being really realistic about the constraints, and then going back to your team or going back to yourself and being creative. And that's the key to the vision, because you can look at problems and you can be really, really disheartened, and you can start to think, well, if only it wasn't like this, we would be a great school, or I'd be a great head teacher, or I'd be a great teacher, but I never will be. I never will be, because we always face these problems. But actually, it's about sort of, for me, great schools are set up to deal with these things.
Yeah,
a great head teacher takes a knock and comes back stronger.
Yeah.
So when I do face those things, I feel personally very clear on my vision, for myself and for the schools that I serve. They always serve it, because part of the vision is to be a really positive, resilient school which can handle a lot of bumps in the road, and handle them in a way it looks after people, and other people could look to us and think, well, that was a good example.
Yeah.
So when I face those issues, I face them with real sort of genuine optimism.
Yeah, and I think a couple of things I would sort of add to support what you've just said is sort of a deep philosophical point, which is about, as human beings, we do need to. Life is about solving problems ultimately, and that may sound oversimplistic, but if you think of any area of your life, that's what it's about. Whether it's something you choose as a hobby, whether it's responsibilities you have in life, whatever that is. Whether it's buying a house, whatever, you are solving. Everything is about solving problems. And so in order for us to solve these problems, whether it's what we're going to eat later, or what house do we need to live in, or anything like that, that gives you the feeling of progress. And if you make progress, I think that gives you a sense of fulfillment. So it's important we do it. And it reminded me when you were talking then about the school and creating that school, I'd heard something about If you take a sort of a sailing analogy, you cannot plot a route to avoid the storms. That's impossible. What you've got to do is make sure you build a boat that can cope with those storms, because you're going to go through them. And that is a sort of a metaphor for anything in life. But if we use it for school leadership, and be at peace with the fact that there will be problems to solve, but also that's what we want to do. Yeah. We want to do those things because we're going to improve things. So having a process and these steps, I think it's really important as a structure to go about those things, because we know it's going to happen, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing that we need to do these things. But we can be intentional and be really deliberate by using these steps. Yeah,
that's it. And naturally, it probably would be quite a sort of dry conversation if you just sort of follow these steps really, really rigidly. But I do think, if you're leaving any of them out, then you have to replace them with something, would be my advice. Yeah. But if we talk about kind of that monitoring the progress, which is you kind of follow, communicate and monitor the progress of the plan, would be your final part of the framework. What I would say on that is that there's, and this is sort of, we're into the weeds a little bit, but this is quite an important distinction, is that be very careful with what you monitor. Be very careful of what you monitor, because as a leader, it drives your culture more than anything other than sort of promotions and kind of sanctions. What you choose to sort of sanction and criticise, and what you choose to praise and reward, that for me, like, that drives culture sort of more than anything else. And then I'd say close to that though is what you monitor. Yes. So if you're monitoring how many words the children write in an hour, that's going to go up.
Yes,
absolutely. Because people but then that comes with consequences, because it might come from more efficient practice. But it also might come from somebody just trying to find a way to drive that number up, because they are coming from a good place and trying to please that leadership structure. But if I was a sales manager, if the thing that I monitored was how many hours people spent in the office, what's going to happen to that office over the next? If I monitored how many how many sales people made instead, what's going to happen there? Yeah. But the important thing is there, and granted, you would say, well, they've got to make sales and they've got to spend time in the office. It's being deliberate though.
Yeah,
it's being deliberate about what you monitor, and it will be a comment on your skill as a leader if you choose the right things to monitor.
Yes,
that are in line with your vision, that are in line with your values, and that drive you towards your strategic solution. And if you pick the wrong thing to monitor, then you'll drive the wrong thing, and you might drive yourself towards a positive number. It might be very damaging culturally.
Yeah,
it might make the place a really nice place to be, but it might make it a very difficult place to live to be, because it's not achieving. And then so there's a real skill set around what you select to monitor and what you select to measure.
And that's why I think it's important, as you said at the start of that piece, about looking through all these steps, because step 7 of that return to the values, I think, would help mitigate against those things. So there's an opportunity to constantly check if you go through these steps. You can pause and check that this is going to work. Is this still in line? Even before anything's been implemented. And then the nature of what these steps suggest are done as actions also will require appropriate measurement and communication throughout the implementation of this thing, whether it's 6 months, 2 years, whatever it is. So you constantly have the opportunity to evaluate its success. As you say, is there something in the plan that's not working, or is it the way it was executed, or was it an external thing that we didn't see coming? So there would have been lots of schools that they would have had to altered, lots of organisations, but we're talking about schools, will have had to alter their plans during the pandemic, because that was a huge thing that was unforeseen, and that will have impacted on lots of plans they had. And then following that, lots of other plans then had to be created, because the context and the situation significantly changed, hadn't it? So those are the things that had to be done. But having these steps allows you to keep checking prior to implementation and during implementation, which I think is in itself a really strategic way of leading.
And what I'd say to that as well is that you can go back to it as well, and you're not just reviewing how good was this, how effective was this. You could go back through the steps and say, right, let's just look at these, or on our reflection, which steps did we execute really well, and which steps did we think maybe were softer. And I think we'll be able to put this into the description of the podcast, so people can have the kind of steps set out there. So
to refer to
that reference point will be there. One of the things, and across the whole sort of the Kilter taxonomy, the difference between process and outcome is there a lot. And I'd say, again, that's probably quite a helpful thing to talk around with that kind of monitoring, which is that you can monitor process or you can monitor outcomes. And the monitoring process means you monitor the things that people do.
Yep.
And then monitoring outcomes is the tangible results that they achieve. Yep. Now, I'm not going to shock anyone when I say you need a balance. You need a balance in all things, but it's really important that if you only focus on outcomes, you can inadvertently drive some behaviours that you don't want, and you can really stifle performance, and you just really lose that influential. If you monitor process and the things that people are doing and how often they're doing them and the way that they're doing them, you can drive culture. Yes. If you monitor only outcomes, you're lucky if the culture improves in the way that you want it to.
Yeah.
Does that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we talk a lot, don't we, in the various series of these podcasts about individual talents and strengths, and we know, don't we, you and I are different, that, you've joked before that you can walk into a room and there's a whiteboard, and if it's got a number on and your name next to it, you'll just immediately go, have I got to get higher or lower than that? And then that's what you require. Whereas I know that wouldn't be the sort of motivation for me. Something like that could make my shoulders drop because I think, I've got this thing to do. So that's another reason why I think you've got to have both of those things, to be absolutely clear on what we want to achieve, absolute clarity on the process. Because then someone like me, I can forget about that outcome number. Mm-hmm. I'm just going to really focus on the process, which is the same. We've talked about this with other things, haven't we? The goal is to be able to run a 10K event at some point in the future. Okay, well, just go and run then. Mm-hmm. And the process will be about forming a habit of becoming a runner, being the type of person you want to be, that sort of thing. So I think that's important, and that can appeal to others. Some might really revel in the sort of weekly metric checks or whatever it is. So you've got to have both, mm-hmm. and ensure the balance is there so that it's achieving what you want to achieve, which is why these steps are important. Because again, different people, I looking at these 9 steps, I know I'm naturally drawn to some of them, mm-hmm. and then probably wouldn't be as thorough with others.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's really useful to me, even though I'd consider myself to be an experienced leader and have a stronger understanding of strategic leadership than I did some years ago. But I still need these tools. I'm never going to remember all this.
And I'd absolutely second that, because although I am more naturally strategic, and Clifton Strength says so. It's not just me being arrogant.
Yeah, it's true.
It's all science fact. But the reason I created this framework was because there were areas I was softer on. I don't go to constraints. I'm very positive and optimistic. Yeah. So I didn't go to metrics, and then the way that I communicated and monitored, I would say lacked forethought and discipline, because I had such strong areas, I could get by on that. So, this was designed not just for people that don't have that sort of natural skill set, but for those who do, because we always sort of lean towards another, we always lean to that.
Absolutely, because I think it's what we're used to, aren't we? As a sort of a natural human thing, that we'll go to that thing that we're strong at or we're good at, because it is easier and because we're good at it. So we will be naturally drawn to that. But what you just talked about, what we're just talking about there with process and outcomes, is balance, isn't it?
Yeah.
A lot of this is about balance. A balance between reacting to something and being strategic. A balance between process and outcomes. A balance between, as a leader, depending on your role and what that looks like on a day-to-day basis. How much time do you spend time sort of away from the areas where you need to be reactive versus areas where you're in the thick of it? Because a class teacher role is going to be different to a head teacher role. And so depending upon your role, to me, it's all about a balance and reflecting on, have you got that balance right? And then not beating yourself up when the balance is wrong, because that's going to happen from one day to the next, from 1 week to the next. And even that thinking, I think, is an example of being strategic.